This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Today's show is about a cultural stereotype that is so pervasive in this state that many restaurants include menu warnings or simply offer versions of dishes with extremely minimal seasoning. It's the idea that Minnesotans don't like spicy food. You might remember that during the state fair this year, my colleague Eric Roper and I solicited questions from fairgoers. We then asked everyone who passed by the Minnesota Star Tribune booth to vote for their favorites. This one, from Danny Rubio, drew a large number of votes.
Moving to Minnesota, we've known it kind of like I would say watered down in taste and flavors and food. Specifically, from my experience, Mexican food has really been pretty bland. I've made food for friends and neighbors, and I've heard it's spicy. I'm like, whoa, it's just paprika's in there. They really have nothing in there. And then Governor Walz saying that, I'm like, he validated it for me. I was like, there it is. The governor of Minnesota saying black pepper is about it. And so that's why I wanted to ask.
Thanks so much to Danny for this question. I'm here today with my colleague Susan Dew, who took on the challenge of unpacking Minnesota's reputation for spice intolerance for Curious Minnesota. Welcome, Susan. Thanks so much for joining us today. So you cover the city of Minneapolis for the Star Tribune. What drew you to take on this question?
I love doing the Curious column, first of all, because it gives me a little variety from my usual beat. And I love that Danny asked this question. It actually drove a ton of conversation in our newsroom, just as we were trying to decide which reporter should take the question. Everybody had an opinion. A lot of Caucasian reporters in the newsroom say that they actually do love spicy food. So, don't put them in a box. And then there were people of color, myself included, who did not grow up eating a lot of spicy food. I'm from Shanghai, China, where the main profile is sweet because it's in the south of China. But there were a lot of reporters who, the way they reacted to the question in the first place was like, well, what kind of Minnesotans are you talking about? Like, do you have a certain Minnesotan in mind? Does it include me or not? So it was a lot to unpack. And I wanted to do that through history, through immigration, through agriculture, and through a little bit of psychology, too.
Yeah, this was not the easiest question to answer. I thought you were brave to take it on, especially since anytime someone generalizes about how Minnesotans are, it's always leaving out so many people. Obviously, not all Minnesotans avoid spicy food, but it is enough of a thing that it merited a real investigation, especially after Governor Walz called black pepper the top of the spice level in Minnesota during his run for vice president. And you really took a thoughtful approach to this, and you ended up gathering so many great perspectives from chefs to a food scientist. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached the reporting and figured out what sources to talk to?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to, first of all, explore the building blocks of how it is that we eat as humans, understanding that there are evolutionary aspects to the food that we are attracted to, and then also regional differences that came about with the development of culture, and then how those regional differences transformed with the exchange of different cultures, and how the cuisines of a particular community could have developed independently of an immigrant diaspora that settled, far away, and how there could have been new infusions of flavors that came in with each successive wave of immigrants. And at the same time, there is chemistry at play here with how different kinds of ingredients affect people as they consume them. So I love that this question came at the juncture of science and culture.
Minnesotans' relationship with spice has to do with a lot of different factors, including geography. And why is that?
So for the longest time, chilies couldn't be grown in very northern parts of the world. That includes the northern European countries where the first wave of immigrants to this region came from. Chili peppers didn't grow here naturally. And so the indigenous peoples that lived here for tens of thousands of years before Europeans arrived didn't have chilies either. This region just is cold and dark and wet, and chili peppers, which we associate with those spicy flavors that are in anything that's hot, that has heat, need to grow in dry, hot climates. So this isn't the place where they grew. It really required cultural exchange and international trade for different cultures across the world to learn about chili peppers. So scientists basically believe that chili peppers probably originated in the Amazon basin, modern-day Brazil, and that this search for spice was a huge driver of European exploration. You know, Christopher Columbus was tasked with finding a new route to India, where at the time they were obtaining all these spices that were exorbitantly expensive in Europe, black pepper being one of them. So in medieval Europe especially, there was very little flavor to the food. Spices were a extremely desired commodity. And that's what drove a lot of exploration and push of traders to go into Asia and, you know, by accident, the Americas.
And you also talked with the chef at Awamni about how they use indigenous ingredients from south of the border to flavor their food, not only using the indigenous ingredients here.
Right. So Awamni, the award-winning restaurant, is famously predicated on the idea that they only use pre-colonial ingredients that could be found on the continent before Europeans arrived. And so you can see that a lot of indigenous ingredients are present in those foods that people stereotypically associate with Minnesota cuisine, like there's wild rice in a lot of dishes as a part of the meat and potatoes that are considered staple foods here. There's a lot of use of game. Awamni builds menus based on those ingredients, but if it were not for their willingness to use chili peppers from South America, which weren't used by the indigenous peoples that populated the Great Lakes and northern plains of Minnesota, then their menu would have a lot less flavor than it currently does, which is what the executive chef at Awamni, Lee Garman, told me. And I found that really fascinating, that the indigenous cultures here also had the same lack of spice as our northern European immigrants from Scandinavia.
That is super interesting. And you talked with a food scientist who told you that people aren't born with different taste preferences, right? When do they come in and why?
Yeah, so Job Ubink, head of the food science department at the University of Minnesota, told me that when people are born, infants usually have this universal attraction to slightly sweet, fatty foods because that's mother's milk. And so it's only when they get a little older that they start to acquire different tastes. And a lot of that has to do with their upbringing. So at a fairly young age is when people start to develop their core foods. And it was interesting that Job described how there's often an emotional component to a person's development of their core foods. They're often connected to a memory of a person when they were taken care of as a child, when they were served something by a mother figure that made them feel safe. Although people, when they get older, become more adventurous, meet new friends, and travel to new places, they can often expand their palates. They will still often go back to those core foods. And Chef Yia Vang of Union Hmong Kitchen actually discussed the same concept with me, where he talked about how if you ask people what they would want their last meal to be, they'll probably, 90% of the time describe a meal that they had as a child served at their family's dinner table.
Talking about expanding palates, you mentioned in the story that Scandinavians today don't actually eat some of the mild-flavored traditional foods that are still popular in Minnesota. How did that happen?
Yes. So I also spoke with Erin Svensson-Klott, who is the food programs coordinator at the American Swedish Institute. She studies Scandinavian food, has lived in Sweden for a time, and hosts visiting food researchers from the old country who want to come here to Minnesota and study how it is that traditional Swedish foods have been preserved here in America. So we had a very interesting conversation about how the Scandinavians who live in Scandinavia have actually changed the way that they eat through cultural exchange with other European countries and with immigrant communities that have swept through Europe in the intervening decades, and how different Scandinavian communities have actually developed compared to how the Scandinavian diaspora and their descendants in Minnesota have developed their cuisines. So interestingly, there are some very traditional Swedish foods like Ingebrigtsen's Christmas potato sausage that Swedes, when they come here, are kind of shocked to learn that we eat. Whereas in Minnesota, it's a very common Christmas food in some communities. It makes sense because Minnesota is littered with small towns filled with people who are descendants from regions of Scandinavia, and they have preserved through their nostalgia and their homesickness these recipes that they've passed down through the generations, while at the same time, modern Europe is full of different cultural influences.
I thought this was super interesting because potato sausage is one of the foods that I would eat as a kid. And it's mostly just because of my grandparents. But yeah, that was passed along. It does have some flavor, but definitely not spicy. So talking about spicy food, one thing that I thought was interesting is that there is science behind why so many people find spicy food to be exhilarating. What are some of the reasons?
So I didn't get into huge detail about capsaicin and how it acts on people. But there have been lots of studies that show that spicy food can be slightly addictive for certain reasons. There have been studies done by teams of Korean scientists on mice. I think part of it is that eating spicy foods, especially if you're not acclimated, can be a little painful, but it can create kind of a numbing sensation. And as that passes, it can also leave behind a feeling of pleasure. And there are also pain-killing qualities, which is why capsaicin is used in painkillers. It's the idea that it's a break in the tempo of an otherwise bland food, that it creates a jolt of a certain sensation that is able to break up, fatty foods or extremely sweet foods and just give it some variety, give it more depth.
We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. The food scientist that you talked to had some theories about Walz's spice joke in particular that I thought were interesting.
Yeah. So Walz had made this joke about how he only eats white guy tacos. As a Minnesotan, black pepper is the top of the spice level for him. He also made some other, dad jokes about Minnesotan culture, such as how turkey is considered vegetarian here. And so I think a lot of people looked at those quips as pretty innocuous jokes that we hear all the time. Maybe you roll your eyes and groan a little bit, like his daughter did when he told her, a vegetarian, that she could eat the turkey. So Job Ubink at the University of Minnesota, he thought that Walz's jokes about Minnesota stereotypes served a double purpose of pointing out that these were in-group qualities, that Minnesotans can be self-effacing, that there are certain quirks to what it means to be a Minnesotan that we all get because we're from here. And so that sort of signaling can show through comments about food, which is a huge part of culture, that Minnesotans have a unique and quirky culture.
And while this is definitely a thing you see on menus, and you mentioned at the state fair, there's a taco stand that will ring a bell and yell, "It's not spicy," whenever anybody asks them, because they get the question so often. But it is also true that palates have been changing over the decades in Minnesota. And what are some of the reasons for this change?
So there have been many new waves of immigrants to Minnesota, and they have just added to the tapestry of flavors here. It was after the 1960s and 70s, after the Vietnam War, when there were a lot of Vietnamese folks that came over. And that's when the Star Tribune actually started writing about pho and pad thai. Around that same time, actually, we were also writing about gyros for the first time, which I thought was hilarious. We were having to print the phonetic spelling of gyro because I guess no one had eaten them before here. And then after the 1990s, early 2000s, many more East African immigrants moved to Minnesota as well. And so nowadays you can find lots of spices from all over the world in your average grocery store, like a Cup Foods spice aisle. You'll be able to find garam masala and Szechuan peppercorn, flavors that our former food editor, Lee Svitek-Dean, who wrote for 40 years at the Star Tribune, she used to test recipes and have to drive around to all of these hole-in-the-wall ethnic grocery stores. And now, because those spices are so common, it really reflects how much our state's palates have changed.
Yeah, I liked how when you talked with Lee, she said that her mom loves Thai food.
Yes, her 93-year-old mother loves the Thai drunken noodles. And this is a woman who Lee said you would serve a lot of meat and potatoes, very lightly seasoned when Lee was growing up.
Yeah, and she mentioned that for her, mashed potatoes still are delicious, even though she loves spicy food these days.
Yeah, so Lee is obviously a very adventurous eater, drawn to a career in which she would eat all sorts of different food. But at the end of the day, she considers her ultimate comfort food to just be plain mashed potatoes. And I think that really reflects what Chef Ye Vang was talking about and what Job Ubing at the university was talking about, that when it comes to our core foods and our favorite foods, they really have a strong emotional component. They are connected to good memories and feelings of safety and security.
Yeah. And so for Lee, you mentioned that mashed potatoes are that comfort food, and we can all think about sort of the dishes that our families served that sort of give you those feelings. But for Ye Vang, comfort food means spice. Can you talk a little about that?
Absolutely. Ye Vang told me that the first thing that comes to his mind when he thinks about maybe the last meal he would eat, it goes back to a time when he was sick from school and his parents served him some homemade sausage, and it came with this little dip that actually burned him at first. But then he loved the flavor so much that he continued to seek them out. And he said that's pretty much how a lot of young Hmong kids grow up. They eat what the parents serve, and with more exposure, their tolerance to spice raises. The same was true of Danny Rubio, who was the reader who posed the question in the first place. He told me that he had this indelible memory of how, as a child, his aunt cracked open a can of jalapenos and showed him and just fished one out of the can and ate the whole thing. And she told him, this is how we eat jalapenos. And that memory stuck with him. And that is indeed, how he came to enjoy those peppers. It was definitely true that in my conversations with everybody as a part of this column, that when they talked about food and the food that they like, they often would go back to some childhood memory.
That's very cool. One part of the story I thought was really interesting was when you talked with Chef Vang, and he said that at the booth that he runs at the state fair, which is really popular, he shared how it makes him feel when some people reject his food because the sauces, which are on the side, are spicy.
When a chef like Ye Vang puts his heart out there, so to speak, someone who is sharing his culture and providing opportunities for people of different walks of life to come and try different flavors. He said that it was disappointing for him when people kind of turn it down without even trying. You know, it's hard to know what that prospective customer's experiences may have been with spicy food in the past and, you know, what they can handle physically. But I think there's always some cultural abrasion, friction when there are new things on the table and a bit of fear perhaps, and maybe self-limitation when it comes to someone's willingness to at least give it a try.
So this story gathered lots of comments, more than 50. And a lot of them were super interesting, including one from someone who said that their mother-in-law found the dipping sauce for Pizza Hut breadsticks to be too spicy. So it just showed some of the range. Some saying, you know, I get heartburn. It's not that I don't want to try things, but this is just not going to work for me. And then others sharing about moving here and wondering what's up with needing to request like the spicy dish off the menu at restaurants where you might think that the food would be spicy, but it is prepared in a really mild way.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. I'm glad that people are sharing their experiences. And I have gotten some emails. I think it's great that everybody kind of gets, you know, where the stereotype is coming from. Everybody kind of knows what Minnesota spicy means. It's just one of those things. So I'm glad that folks are unpacking the topic and also sharing what it is that they love to eat and where that came from.
I agree. Okay, that's it for today's show. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send a note to curious@startribune.com.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.